Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, July 25th, 2023. Time for another show. I don't remember this thing. Oh, yeah, it's the microphone. Okay, time for us to go and get caught up on what's happening for the day. It is Tuesday, but it's one of those Tuesdays after we've had a break. So, I don't know. I barely remembered to show up this morning as well. We'll see whether things work out with Joan's call. I always forget to check in ahead of time and say, oh, hey, by the way, it's coming up on Tuesday, because I don't want to, bother her all the time. But she's pretty good about this these days, and it's when we skip a week or two that we tend to miss these dates. But that's okay, and I sound like Trump now, but that's okay, it's really fine, it doesn't matter, I'm just going to go completely crazy. Anyway, so fingers crossed that everything is fine, and it usually is, and she gives a thumbs up. And I feel bad about doing this every time because it makes it sound like somehow Joan is, irresponsible in some way. And I mean, come on. It's like 7:30 in the morning, first of all, when she has to call in. And second of all, what responsibility does she really have to make this show work? None, right? She has a job. She works for someone completely different. And what the hell is your problem already, right? Okay. So anyway, we're just two normal folks going about our business and trying to put together an entertaining radio show for you. And sometimes we're not there when, Tuesday rolls around. Or sometimes we're not there for an entire week because we go to the Bahamas, right? Yeah, nobody has a problem with that. Okay. So, anyway, lots to catch up on. And I think in laying the groundwork for speaking to Joan later, we ought to get ready for this. Of course, it is Tuesday, and that means that even if Joan isn't available, or she's on vacation, or any of those things, we are legally obligated to warn you about the upcoming government shutdown, because there's always going to be one. Because so far, it seems we constantly just have to have Republicans in our government somewhere, even though the thing they like to do, generally their main function in life appears to be screwing up the normal governance of things and then creating government shutdown. So this one's coming. I know Joan has written on it as well. It's probably largely based in the same story. What I have in front of me, because they email me all the time, is a story from The Hill. Emily Brooks writes on the GOP bracing for Republican versus Republican spending fight in the House. Joan had written this up a couple of days prior to their piece, one titled, in her title, House Senate Showdown on Government Funding Already Brewing. And my thesis is that this July 24th piece in The Hill reflects a lot of what was already reported by Joan on July 21st, but we will see. All right, well, here's the Hill version of things. House Republicans are bracing for fights over spending as GOP leadership aims to bring the first 2 of 12 appropriations bills to the floor this week. Remember that they imposed upon themselves the rule that if they didn't get all 12 done, that they wouldn't pass any of them. They wouldn't have a vote on any of them until all 12 were reported out of committee. So I guess we're already able to check on that and see whether they lived up to that. I mean, I really didn't think that they would be able to. And I don't think, I think that was the demand of the Freedom Caucus types. And there was no actual commitment to it by the leadership. So, it's not something that we can hold against the leadership per se. They may never have agreed to it. Anyway, they're aiming to bring the first 2 of the 12 appropriations bills to the floor this week, which means either the Freedom Caucus demand is being ignored, or somehow they've managed to clear all 12 through committee already. This despite vocal criticism from the party's right flank over not cutting enough spending. My guess is if they didn't clear all 12 bills through committee, but are bringing these 2 to the floor, then one, that means they're ignoring the Freedom Caucus. And two, it probably means that the Freedom Caucus is trying to paper over their demand and pretend like they never made it or were never serious about it so that they don't look like they got rolled in this. Democrats are not expected to give the GOP any help with passing the funding bills, leaving Republicans to pass them with just a slim majority, creating the very real possibility that the GOP will be short on votes as they are on intellect. How the GOP deals with the first two bills ahead of a long August recess will set the tone for expected spending showdowns ahead of the September 30th government funding deadline and potentially bigger spending showdowns with the Senate this fall. Hardline conservatives have long pressed Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and he's really not, to further slash spending in the House bills, aiming to take the most extreme position ahead of expected funding negotiations with the Senate this fall. A group of 21 House Republicans, mostly made up of members of the House Freedom Caucus and their allies, and those who have been ejected from the House Freedom Caucus probably, wrote in a letter to the Speaker earlier this month that they plan to vote against spending bills they think contain insufficient overall cuts. The two measures scheduled for House consideration this week are the Department of Veterans Affairs and Military Construction Bill, MILCON, as they used to call it in the shorthand back in my Hill days, and they probably still do, along with the Agriculture, Rural Development and Food and Drug Administration bill. The first actually boosts funding for the VA, can't have that, in an effort to combat Democratic talking points that claimed Republicans would slash benefits for veterans. Aha! Well, we're not going to, except then we'll be forced to by the Freedom Caucus later on. The main disagreement between the right flank and the GOP, referenced in the letter earlier this month, is over reallocated rescissions to increase discretionary spending above that top line. Lots of jargon there. Decrying what some have called a budgetary gimmick to include clawbacks of previously approved spending in getting to fiscal 2022 levels. Of course, they hate the idea that, briefly explained, they're talking about unexpended funds from previous budget years being clawed back and used in the current or upcoming budget year. Which, of course, if you had budgeted at your kitchen table and you had budgeted whatever it is, $100, $1,000 for something, and you didn't end up using it, you would claw that $1,000 back and put it in your current budget. You have the $1,000, right? So you would do it. That's called doing your budget just like Americans do around their kitchen table every year. Except, of course, that's not actually how things work. And now they're mad about that not actually being how things work. Because just because the money was authorized doesn't mean, in their view, that it existed and was ready to go and was sitting in a bank somewhere. But that's the way federal government budgeting actually works. The money isn't all collected and then put in Fort Knox and then handed out dollar by dollar. But, that's just one of the reasons why you don't do the budget like you do at the kitchen table. If you did do your budget, if your budget really worked like a kitchen table budget, then yes, you would be able to claw this money back and spend it and not raise your debt, not increase your debt. So, of course, that's a huge problem, and they can't have that. A main disagreement between I did this one. That's what we were just talking about. The House Freedom Caucus is set to hold a press conference with the president of advocacy group FreedomWorks, remember them, on Tuesday morning about the appropriations bills. I can't believe they're even still relevant. Democrats intentionally funded a bloated federal bureaucracy, and if we don't reset discretionary spending now, Republicans are effectively accepting and enshrining absurd COVID levels, I guess COVID pandemic era spending levels. FreedomWorks said in a post urging the public to demand lower spending levels, and the public is responding with a resounding yawn, of course. They don't even understand what they're being asked for. And if they did, they would just say, well, we don't really care about that. If you have money, spend it. Some conservatives have expressed confidence that the Appropriations Committee approved bills will see changes before final passage. And it is a possibility through either the House Rules Committee or through amendments. Those on the right flank are also prioritizing policy changes through the power of the purse. The policy changes, of course, policy making in an appropriations bill is ordinarily against House rules and would be subject to a point of order. But Republicans are going to ignore that because why don't you justism? We should just make policy in every bill and give ourselves waivers. Well, we'll see whether they're able to make that work with their slim majorities. Representative Chip Roy summarized the position of hardline conservatives in a tweet Monday. To consider funding federal government, 1, return federal bureaucracy to pre-COVID. We're not pre-COVID. We're not even really post-COVID yet. 2, end border invasion and Fed attack on Texas. By all means, continue attacking Texas. Go for it. 3, end FBI weaponization. 4, end racist DEI government policies. 5, make Europe handle Ukraine. 6, end war on reliable energy. So just basically entire wish list of every Republican conservative. All you have to do is grant us everything we've ever asked for, top to bottom. And then, if you do, we'll allow government to exist. No. The 10 bills passed out of the House Appropriations Committee so far, which answers our question now, there are 10 of the 12. That's pretty good, quite honestly. But I guess if you don't write a serious bill, then it's a doable thing. The reason it usually takes so long is if you're serious about things, you got to iron out a lot of details. If you just slap something together and say, we'll fix it at the House Rules Committee or through the amendments process, then I guess you do it. But they still didn't make it to their 12. And yet they have scheduled floor action for the first 2. So, yeah, they'll erase the demand that they made, I guess. The 10 bills passed out of the House Appropriations Committee so far did so along partisan lines, with Democrats angry that House Republicans moved to write the 12 appropriations bills with an overall top-line target that was lower than the spending caps that McCarthy negotiated with President Biden in the debt limit increase bill in June. The White House on Monday said that Biden would veto either bill if it came to his desk, I guess these first 2, taking issue not only with the additional spending cuts and rescissions, but with culture war provisions concerning abortion, diversity and inclusion initiatives, and gender-affirming care. Pressure from hardline conservatives poses challenges for Republican appropriators and moderates. The challenge, they note, is making sure that final funding bills can eventually pass the House and get signed into law. You're not gonna get everything you want. Oh, well, that's interesting news for the Republicans. But they are getting numbers-wise and policy-wise many of the things that are good for them. Representative David Joyce, Republican of Ohio, a subcommittee chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and chairman of the more moderate Republican governance group, Caucus Governance, recently told The Hill, it's important to pass appropriations bills that dictate the policies and procedures and how the money is going to be spent and where it is going to be spent, Joyce said, adding that it's certainly an understanding we haven't reached yet. Just again, for the record, while he thinks it's important to pass appropriations bills that dictate the policies and procedures and how money is going to be spent, in fact, that violates House rules. Appropriations bills are, of course, supposed to be about how the money is going to be spent and where it's going to be spent, but the policies and procedures are the provenance of the authorizing committees, not the appropriations committees, and it is against House rules to legislate in an appropriations bill. We'll see, of course, how Republicans rule from the chair, or whether Democrats even bother to raise points of order against some of these provisions. I imagine that they will, and that Republicans will vote on party line basis to either ignore or overrule these points of order. So we got that going on. The way Joan described things 3 days earlier, last Friday, House-Senate showdown on government funding already brewing. We'll see whether there's a different approach on these things. The House and Senate finished work for the week Thursday afternoon, no doubt traipsing off to finalize plans for the 6-week stretch of August recess. They should plan to rest up during those weeks because September is going to be fraught in light of what leaders in each chamber decided to do this week. That would be last week. The Senate's top appropriators added $13.7 billion in government funding above the limits President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy agreed to in the deal they made to resolve the last debt ceiling crisis. House leaders, who've been whittling down that number to appease hardliners, slashed it even further. The top two Senate appropriators, Democrat Patty Murray and Republican Susan Collins, announced in a committee meeting Thursday that they had agreed to add $13.7 billion in additional emergency appropriations, including $8 billion for defense and $5.7 billion for non-defense, spread across four subcommittees. Those four are Homeland Security, Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education. Oh, and Education. There we go. So the right emphasis there. And, oops, I left off something. Oh, yes, right. Okay, just I'll reread that for you because the emphasis is important here. The four bills. Homeland Security, we understood that one. The next one is a bill that combines the departments, spending for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Department of Education. They very often lump several. I've often thought that they ought to do each department independently, but for some reason, well, one, they don't, and two, that doesn't always make as much sense. And there's like lots. There could be billions and billions being spent, of course, for defense, and doing the singly the Department of Education budget. It leaves a tremendous amount of spending power in the hands of the people on the Armed Services Appropriations committees, but not much, of course, under the control of the education people. So they combine them. And, there's not really, I don't think, intentionally designed to give each appropriations subcommittee the same amount of money to deal with, but there's a workload share that I think is addressed this way. But just so you know, so there's a Homeland Security bill, a Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education, Labor, HHS, and Ed, right? State and Foreign Operations, that's a separate bill. And then the fourth one is the Departments of Commerce, Department of Justice, and Science. We don't have a Department of Science, but there's a Science Appropriations, and that, of course, would cover, well, everybody that you would imagine. Certainly several departments have a hand in the science thing, and NASA, et cetera, but you get the idea. Okay, so those are the four bills that Murray and Collins had announced on Thursday that they had added this additional money for. So, where were we? Members on both sides of the aisle, on and off committee, have voiced serious bipartisan concerns about the cuts in the debt ceiling deal to vital non-defense programs and the caps it imposes on defense spending, Murray said in announcing the increases. The only opposition in the committee came from Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who groused about debt. Unfortunately, it looks like yet another gimmick is being pursued. Oh no, not a gimmick. Joe Manchin hates gimmicks. This time outside the purview of the debt ceiling agreement, right here in our own committee, he said, it's just plain wrong. It takes us off the promising path that we have started on to get our fiscal house back in order. He offered and then withdrew an amendment to block the additional funding because he believed in it so strongly. Manchin stands out as the only true ally the House Freedom Caucus has in the whole Senate, and he's a Democrat. Most Senate Republicans and plenty of Democrats were opposed to the agreement that Biden and McCarthy made because of the too low, in their minds, defense funding levels. And they recognize that to get buy-in to boost the military, they also have to increase funding on the non-defense side. While the Senate was increasing available funding, House Republican leaders were extorted into appeasing hardliners by making even deeper cuts than those negotiated in the debt ceiling agreement. They met Wednesday with Freedom Caucus Chair Scott Perry of Pennsylvania and said they'd try to trim $115 billion from their top line, which leadership had already slashed down from the level agreed to in the debt ceiling deal to try to get the extremists on board. So they already did the work they thought was going to appease the extremists, but the extremists said, we're extreme, we want more. McCarthy is going to try to move two appropriations bills on the floor next week. Now we find out he's actually going ahead with that, or trying to fund the Agriculture and Veterans Affairs departments. The extremists are already threatening those two bills, which should be straightforward and non-controversial. They often are, and they often are why they tend to go first. in the order of things year after year. Representative Byron Donalds of Florida, a Freedom Caucus a-hole, told Politico, it says it right here in her story, told Politico that his message to leadership on these bills is FAFO, essentially, except he says the whole dang thing. F around and find out. Okay. Not that he has a problem with either of these bills per se, that the per se is his own quote, but he doesn't want them getting any ideas about the other 7 or 8 bills that have to be worked through, and I don't think we're there yet. And of course, it's more than 7 or 8. If he's talking about these 2, then they have 10 to go. The extremists are plotting their poison pills for these 2 bills, injecting the fight over the Pentagon's abortion leave policy into the VA appropriations bill because it also includes military construction. They will also likely try to slash food stamps in the agriculture bill. That's going to force the rest of the Republicans into casting unpopular votes again. They really don't know how to win elections. All right. So, by the way, did you catch that note? The VA, the Veterans Affairs Appropriations Bill, also includes not regular military operations, but military construction. Not Veterans Affairs construction, building of hospitals, but military construction, bases, etc. I don't know why they lump them together that way, but I guess it's just a division of labor thing like we were talking about before. There was some talk before the July 4th recess of House leadership about trying to ready a stopgap bill, wow, can't believe it, that would push the funding deadline back and take a government shutdown off the table. That discussion appears to have died down, and as of now, it doesn't look like the hardliners would go along with that anyway. There are just a few days of legislative work scheduled in the House next week, that's this week, which will be taken up by the 2 appropriations bills if the extremists allow them to go to the floor. Then there are only 12 work days scheduled in the House during September and 16 in the Senate, while leadership teams and their staff will be working through the long recess on the funding bills. They can't make much progress with everyone gone. That means Republicans definitely need to figure some stuff out while Congress is in recess, like how they'll fight the tiny minority of their extremist members to avoid a shutdown. It's either that or reconcile themselves to the fact that they're going to let a dozen or so nihilists ruin everything, including the prospects for a Republican majority in the House after 2024. So they have some work to do, even during their break. So that should be pretty exciting for them. And as you know, they like to take on additional work because they're so industrious. All right, I got to mark each of those things and keep them open for, or keep them in pocket so I can share them with you later. Let's see. Other things that, oh, dang, I didn't actually mean to do that. Well, see if we can reopen some of those. Oh, yeah, look at that, right, the recently closed tabs. I closed Joan's story, even though I wanted to keep her page open so that we could, see everything that was going on. All right, and have all of her stories ready for when she comes on and we chat about them. But there are some other things, even some things that she hasn't talked about or covered, but knows plenty about that we might want to share with you from out of pocket. And there are many. Let's see. We're coming up on the first break here, so let's see if we can find something to add that's not that long. How about this one? How about a little bit of local news? This one happened to catch my eye because I've been waiting for these decisions to start being made. I've read this from Erin in the Morning. This is Kagro in the Morning. We refer to our other in the morning colleagues from time to time. I think it's the first time. Erin Reed, who puts together Erin in the Morning, which is I don't know. What do people even call them, blogs anymore? It's not a Substack, but it looks an awful lot like one. But so do blogs. So anyway, Erin in the Morning provides this bit of news for us Virginians. Arlington Public Schools say no and refuse to comply with anti-trans state policy. You may have heard, not because we discussed it, that was away, but last week, I guess it really was in the last week, Governor Glenn Youngkin approved, we knew this was coming down the pike, approved an anti-trans model school board policy that bans trans people from bathrooms, forcibly outs them, etc., etc. Arlington Public Schools The biggest is system. Well, maybe it's not the biggest system. I guess Fairfax is the biggest system in Northern Virginia, but still a leader in the area. And the local school boards tend to go the same way. Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, and of course Loudoun sometimes will join in. Prince William sometimes as part of the Northern Virginia block. Will end up going the same ways. Arlington Public Schools has announced it will not comply. And here's what Aaron, has to say about this. First, I clicked that I want to continue reading it. Yes, I do. In a disheartening move last week, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, super moderate fleece guy, finalized discriminatory policies toward transgender students in the state by approving a controversial model policy for school boards. It doesn't impose it, I guess. But the model policy, a significant step back in the protections for trans students, drastically curtails their rights when in public schools. The original policy was released in 2002 to outcry from several school districts and civil rights defenders and was required to go through a long period of public comment before being finalized, because that's the law. But they were going with the why don't you justism approach at first. Thousands of students walked out of schools in protest over 70,000 public comments were submitted, most against the measure. In response to the now approved model policies, Arlington Public Schools, one of the state's most prominent districts, has responded with outright refusal. They have pledged to reject the policies and to continue their defense of the civil rights of their transgender students. So congrats to the smarties of the Arlington School Board. They'll, of course, be railed against. The local Republican activists will, boycott Keurig and Bud Light or something, and say, of course, that they'll be trying to recall all the members of the school board or oust them or sue them or something like that. But in the meantime, expect the local school boards to follow suit, and we'll keep a close eye on what happens here in Loudoun County and see whether we jump on this bandwagon or not. There's more detail if you're interested in exactly how draconian the model policy was. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. You want to hear a little bit more maybe from Aaron in the morning about what exactly was in this model policy? I thought we were giving it a little bit short shrift if we just cut it off there, but we did have to take our break. But just so you know what we're talking about, those model policies, Aaron says, are extreme. They would place Virginia in line with states such as Florida, Arkansas, and Alabama, which, by the way, has also been in the news of late. We'll have to talk a little bit about that at some point. Anyway, they all have Republican supermajorities and have been known for passing the harshest anti-trans laws. We, of course, don't have a Republican supermajority here. And so what the hell, you might ask. Here is a map of states from the Movement Advancement Project showing states with bathroom bans similar to the new Virginia model policies, for example. And of course, it's a map and you can't see it, but I will tell you what's in it. I am the alt text of this map. And let's see. Presumably the worst, most horrific law is designated in red here, and guess who's got it? Florida. It notes here in the key that this is a state that would, to earn the red ranking here, bans transgender people from using, it's behind some text here, or let's see, from using bathrooms and facilities consistent with their gender identity in K through 12 schools and at least some government-owned buildings. There's also a little exclamation point, a red exclamation point notation here that says state law makes it a criminal offense for transgender people to use bathrooms or facilities consistent with their gender identity. Among the rest of the states, there's a sort of, here's sort of a dark, I don't know what, burnt umber. It's something like a darker orange. That is the state where the guy whose governor is running for president and nobody knows who he is, North Dakota. State bans transgender people from using bathrooms and facilities consistent with their gender identity in K through 12 schools and at least some government-owned buildings. That, why is that different from... Oh, I'm sorry. The red states, they're banned from using bathrooms consistent with gender identity in all schools, colleges, and government-owned buildings and spaces. It's even worse than we originally thought. The North Dakota one, which is supposed to be more mild, simply imposes the ban in K through 12 schools and some government-owned buildings. They likewise have this yellow exclamation point warning that says that the state has a law defining sex in ways that may impact transgender people's access to bathrooms or facilities according to their gender identity. And there are 4 states that have got those. They include, aside from the state that nobody knows the governor of, North Dakota, Montana, Kansas, and Tennessee. So then there's a third category of states that says that these states ban transgender people from using bathrooms and facilities consistent with their gender identity in K through 12 schools. So those are the gradations. Banned in schools and at least some government-owned buildings, and then banned in all schools, colleges, and government-owned buildings and spaces. That's the Florida one. Who is on the lowest tier of these bans? Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama. And then the rest of the states, have no such issue. No state ban on transgender people's use of bathrooms or facilities. 41 states, 5 territories, and D.C., thankfully. So the vast majority, which is good news. Okay, back to the story about what are the model policy dictates. The model policies bar trans people from school sports, bathrooms, and, of course, bans affirming teachers from using many trans students' pronouns. Similar laws were proposed in Virginia this year, including a sports ban and a forced outing law. These laws all failed in the Virginia legislature. So get the hell out of here, right? Some of the new and finalized model policies can be seen here. And this is the jargon version of it, how they propose their model policy, the written version that makes it all complicated and confusing, but we can skip down to Aaron's description of these things. These policies, if enacted by the schools, would mandate that teachers misgender trans students, unless, of course, they have parental permission, because listen to the parents, right? But yeah, so if the kid decides that they're transgender and the parents don't give specific permission to do so, teachers would be forbidden from calling them by their preferred pronouns. That would also mandate that trans students use the wrong restroom by stating that trans students have to use restrooms of their, quote, biological sex. It would forcibly out trans students to parents by mandating that schools cannot conceal information about gender from parents. So kids whose parents disapprove and who I guess maybe pretend to be something that they're not when they're at home, but try to be their true selves in school, the school teachers have got to out them to their parents. What else? It would violate student counselor privacy by forcing counselors to get parental consent before speaking about gender identity with a student, and bans trans students from sports, a policy explicitly rejected by the Virginia legislature. These policies stem from a law enacted in 2020, which tasked the State Board of Education with the creation of model policies on transgender student inclusion. The law was conceived with the intent of protecting transgender students' rights in schools and were used to that effect by Governor Ralph Northam at the time. However, Governor Youngkin has manipulated its original purpose by inserting discriminatory measures into this law, bypassing the checks and balances typically provided by the state legislature. This deviation from the law's intended purpose starkly contrasts with the anti-discriminatory purpose it was designed to promote. As a result, as you know, Arlington Public Schools has outright rejected the policy, declaring itself the first school district in the state to do so. The superintendent, Dr. Francisco Duran, stated in a letter, "We have reviewed the model policies and determined that our current policies and policy implementation procedures that protect the rights of our transgender students will stay as it is." You can see the full response of the Arlington Public Schools included in this piece. Arlington does not stand alone in its defiance of the new policies, although it is the only school district to outright reject the latest draft. Earlier last year, when the policies were first released, but before they were finalized, other school districts reacted with similar rejections. Richmond Public Schools, right there in the capital, similarly stated, "We reject Governor Youngkin's model policies." When the first draft was released that year, Falls Church in Alexandria, also close in D.C.'s suburban Northern Virginia districts, released similar letters saying they would reject the policies as well. Fairfax County, when reacting to the current and finalized policy, did not commit to adopting them either, stating, "We believe our current FCPS policies are consistent with federal and state anti-discrimination laws." Moving forward, it is unclear what, if anything, Youngkin can do to force schools to comply with the policies. There are no penalties for noncompliance set out in state law, and no clear way that the governor can enforce them. They are likely to come under challenge, with transgender delegates Danica Rome stating during the first draft released last fall that they likely violate Virginia's Human Rights Act. Moving forward, Virginia residents will be watching closely to see if their own schools adopt the new policies or explicitly reject them in similar fashion to Arlington Public Schools. So no mention of Loudoun. I'm sure they're not super eager to dive into the controversy head first, but I would imagine that the current school board will likely go along with what our neighbors in Northern Virginia are doing. Okay. So, what else did I have that I wanted to share with you? There are some other issues. That was supposed to be one of the shorter ones, remember? But, we got into it, and it felt right to continue on. I mentioned that Alabama was in the news. I can share this with you. I happened to see that Mark Elias, election lawyer extraordinaire, had put together a piece on his Democracy Docket blog / whatever the hell people are calling it these days, about the news that broke last week, and you've no doubt heard it already, that though the Supreme Court essentially, almost kind of sort of, ordered Alabama to redraw their congressional district maps such that there was a second majority black voters district included in their map, and Alabama has declined to do so. It's not quite as bright a line as all of that, I should say, but it was supposedly clearly the intent of the Supreme Court that they wanted to see a second majority black district drawn, because reasons, and good reasons at that. But for bad reasons, I think they hemmed and hawed about it, and they elided a little bit in writing their opinion. And essentially they handed that back a decision that said, well, we think that the district should be redrawn such that they increase the opportunity for black Alabamans to elect the representatives of their choice. And then kind of said this might be done, for instance, by designing a second majority black district or something quite like it. But they couldn't bring themselves to say this is what has to be done. And yeah, Alabama is kind of defying the spirit of it, but not necessarily the letter of it, which I have to object, to the way the Supreme Court put it. They should have put it more strongly, but of course, the Roberts Court looking to straddle the line here. I guess we should count ourselves lucky that the Supreme Court still recognizes the necessity for minority representation at all, given that they have struck down key portions of the Voting Rights Act in recent years past. But I guess they still feel embarrassed about the idea that they justified what they did by saying, well, we're post-racial now in this country because we've elected Barack Obama, and so therefore all the problems are fixed, and you won't have. I mean, it was nice. It was a nice thought. It wasn't a smart thought or a correct thought, but it was a nice thought for a conservative like John Roberts to come to the conclusion that, well, this won't happen anymore because it would be just too damn embarrassing. Nobody in the modern South is going to want to facially discriminate against black voters this way. We all understand that there have been, and still have to be majority black voting districts. And we just think that the people in the South have kind of come to accept that. And even if they're not pure in their motivations about everything, they will agree, they'll view it this way, right? Because they're racist. Give those people the districts that they need, and then we'll be super white and all the rest of them, and we'll drown them out. And it'll be, 5-2 in delegation from Alabama, and everything will be fine. But what Roberts didn't understand or correctly anticipate was that, one, how strong the racism really was, and two, how much more permission they would get to practice it by the next incoming president of the United States, Donald Trump. And it's hard to fault them for not quite seeing that coming, but it isn't that hard to fault them for saying, well, one black president later, that means racism is over. That was jumping the gun, and it was very dumb. So, it's interesting that they even tried to force Alabama to do anything at all, but I think that was part of their embarrassment at having basically been proven completely wrong in the conclusion that was supposed to have supported their Voting Rights Act decisions from back in 2013. And so Mark Elias, I think, has basically, he's an expert, and he comes to the same conclusion, it appears to me, from a quick skim. And let's find out whether we're right about that. Alabama shows our country hasn't changed. That's the headline. That's why I think it's going this direction. 10 years ago, in his landmark opinion in Shelby County versus Holder, remember that's the kind of case that law students now and all future law students will be asked to cite. It's a landmark case. Shelby County versus Holder, Chief Justice John Roberts promised that, quote, our country has changed. He made such a promise to justify the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to disable a key portion of the Voting Rights Act. The preclearance provision, this is what the disabled part was, the preclearance provision that required states with histories of discrimination, like Alabama, to receive federal approval before adopting maps or enacting voting laws. They basically said, well, we don't need that anymore. For nearly 50 years, any change Alabama made to its election laws, including drawing new congressional maps, had to be reviewed in advance and pre-cleared under the Voting Rights Act, or VRA. That's the work of the Voting Rights section of the Department of Justice, which, I guess if there's any excuse for John Roberts going ahead and eliminating this, it was the fact that the George W. Bush administration had already discovered and demonstrated that if you simply put dedicated racists, or at least loyalist Republicans who will do whatever you ask, in the voting rights section and put them in charge, they can just reject the work of the career attorneys who work there and do serious review of what's going on, and simply overrule them and say, no, let's just hand out pre-clearance from the Justice Department, even though these maps are discriminatory on their face. And we will use the imprimatur of the Justice Department's okay, which, we own the stamp now for the time being because George W. Bush is president. And we're just going to do it, even though it doesn't make any logical sense. It is facially discriminatory, but we're going to say it's not. And that stands the whole regime on its head, because even when people say, well, you're being ridiculous, you're doing this for political reasons, and they go to sue, the law was designed such that, well, if the department makes a decision that it's not facially discriminatory, the burden is all on you, and it's even a higher bar to clear for you to have rights to get through to court and have standing and be able to make your case. But if the department says it is facially discriminatory, well, then you'll probably prevail And the burden of proof, therefore, is lower, and the Department of Justice is going to be on your side. So the George W. Bush administration came to understand that this would quash a lot of the lawsuits, even though they were right about the discriminatory intent of the new maps. But they would simply push it out of the way. And then the Roberts court said, well, seeing as how the Department of Justice can just politically push the whole thing out of the way, why don't we take advantage of that and, throw in something about being post-racial and a nod to the Obama election later on and say, well, we're probably post-racial now because of Obama being elected. And even if we're not, without saying so, we'll say, a Republican Department of Justice can negate this whole thing anyway, so how useful is it really? So that's where we were. So all of this changed, as we said, in 2013, when one of its counties, let's see. I skipped a part here, right? If a state failed in its pre-clearance, the new map could not go into effect without the state bearing the burden of persuading a federal court to change that the change did not harm minority voters. But once you get the approval of a highly politicized Department of Justice voting rights section, then you didn't have that burden. The burden fell on everyone else. The people suing had to show that despite the fact that the Department of Justice had said it was A-OK, it really was wrong. So that's a tough road to hoe. Anyway, that all changed in 2013 when one of its counties, Shelby County, argued that the vestiges of discrimination that once plagued the southern state no longer remain. But they do, obviously. Roberts agreed, which was foolish, removing Alabama from pre-clearance and assuring us that things have changed dramatically and that blatantly discriminatory evasions of federal decrees are rare. Now, from what we saw in Alabama last week, things have not changed, not nearly as much as the chief thought, anyway. In its first redistricting cycle since the pre-clearance requirement was lifted, the first time out of the box, lifted in the case, Shelby County, Alabama drew a new congressional map that discriminated against the significant black population in the state. Now, when a federal court struck it down, the state appealed, and the Supreme Court allowed the illegal map to be used for the 2022 midterm elections. Oh, it's too close to the election. It's going to cause confusion, right? 2020 was the redistricting time. They redistricted. Right away, they immediately used their new latitude to draw discriminatory maps. People sued. The courts delayed and then dithered and then finally said, well, we're so close to the election. Why don't you go ahead with this discriminatory map, but come back with a better one in advance of the 2024 elections? Why don't you? Now, after hearing the case and ruling against Alabama in June, plenty of time for them to fix things for 2024. The court sent the state back to the drawing board, ordering it to follow a lower court ruling that required 2 districts in which black voters either comprise a voting age majority or something very close. And those were the weasel words that allowed this next version of the map to go forward. Now, last week, Republicans in Alabama ignored the court's requirements, sort of. Instead, the Republican-controlled legislature proceeded to enact a new map that creates only one majority black district. The next closest district to being majority black is only 39% minorities in that district. That is not, as the court ordered, majority black or very close to it. Now, what happened to blatantly discriminatory evasions of federal decrees being rare, right? The legislators who rammed through this non-compliant map knew what they were doing. Even Governor Kay Ivey, who quickly signed the map, said that the legislature knows our state, our people, and our districts better than the federal courts. To many, it sounded very much like little has changed in 50 years. This obviously non-compliant map will now be reviewed by the same trial court that deemed the previous one illegal. Presumably, the court will replace it with a map drawn to meet its criteria. I don't know. Maybe. The court already hired a special master. Oh my goodness, a special master. Wow. To complete this task if it became necessary. The hearing to review Alabama's non-compliant map is set for August 14th. Alabama's refusal to follow the court order is part of a larger plan. The state's intransigence has already deprived black Alabamans of fair representation in Congress. The initial decision striking down the first map was handed down in January of 2022, yet Alabama's meritless appeals resulted in the illegally racially discriminatory map being used for the 2022 elections. All of this might have been different. It should have been different. But Roberts and the court's majority were confident that things had changed in places like Alabama, even when they had not. Sadly, it's black voters, not the court, who pay the price, right? They are the ones who declared that this thing, racism is over. Well, if you're wrong, the black voters of Alabama are the victims of your wrongness. If you're right, great, terrific, nobody's a victim. But I mean, what skin has the Supreme Court got in this game? We declare racism over. If it's not, well, that sucks. We were wrong about that. But in the meantime, people don't get fair representation. They're discriminated against in official capacities by the state and now the federal government as well. And the court has nothing to do, nothing to say about it. Anyway, the problem's not just limited to Alabama, of course. In fact, the states causing the most trouble over their congressional maps were, uncoincidentally, all pre-cleared prior to Shelby County. In other words, everything that Roberts said was no longer necessary. He was wrong. It was necessary. Shortly after the Alabama map was declared illegal, a different federal court ruled that Louisiana's congressional map was also racially discriminatory. Can't believe it. Similarly, ordering the state to draw a second majority black district. Louisiana also lodged meritless appeals, learning from Alabama, to ensure that the illegal map was used in their 2022 midterm elections. And like Alabama, Louisiana continues to use hardball litigation tactics to try to avoid having to enact a legal non-discriminatory congressional map for 2024 and beyond. Florida, Georgia, and Texas are all continuing to use congressional maps that likely violate the civil rights of their residents. They also hope that the slow pace of litigation will permit racially discriminatory maps to be used again in 2024. South Carolina also faces a redistricting battle in court after federal court struck down its congressional map earlier this year. According to the court, the state had illegally sorted black voters based on race in violation of the U.S. Constitution in order to turn a swing district into a safe one for Republicans. Prior Supreme Court precedents support the lower court's strike down of the map, yet the state has appealed the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, hoping that even if it loses, it will have the discriminatory maps in place for 2024. Too late, too close to an election, can't change things. That's the hope. Not unlike the Trump strategy. And by the way, amazingly, they make race the explicit basis on which they sort their voters into the various districts, even as the same states and the same Republican advocates cheer the court's decision to disallow doing the exact same thing when it comes to trying to help minorities get themselves into college and get a college education. No, we can't have anything to do with race. That has to be eliminated from the picture, unless, of course, it's us using it to our advantage politically, in which case it's awesome. Or at least awesome enough that you should allow us another 2 years to use this thing. Anyway, in state after state, Republican-controlled states are using time as a weapon to discriminate against minority voters. Justice delayed is indeed justice denied, and we know from Alabama that even when justice is served, states will drag their feet to comply. When Roberts wrote his opinion in Shelby County, there were mechanisms in place to prevent states from openly defying a court order, and there was appetite in Congress to preserve those protections. Remember that just a few years earlier, in 2006, the Senate reauthorized the VRA in a 98-0 vote. To use Roberts' words, things have changed dramatically since that unanimous vote. Today, Republicans up and down the ballot openly oppose voting rights. Every single House Republican voted against the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would have reversed the Shelby County decision and restored pre-clearance to states like Alabama that clearly still need it. instead of Republican leaders in Congress voting to reauthorize the VRA and affirming the need for fair maps and voting laws, the current leadership is actively using these states' discriminatory practices for their political gain. Last week, Kevin McCarthy called on Alabama to urge the state to defy the court's order for fear that a second majority black district could swing control of the House. As we watch to see what the court does in Alabama, let's pay just as much attention to states like Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Texas. Without oversight from the federal government this time around and without enough time before the 2022 midterm elections, these states ended up with discriminatory maps that shouldn't have been enacted in the first place. But thankfully, our democracy is not dictated solely by what legislatures do or do not draw. That's why we have courts as the last line of defense, unless, of course, the unitary executive theory prevails later on. So far, the courts have done the right thing in Alabama and Louisiana. Let's hope that they do the same in others where discriminatory maps remain on the books. So, yeah. Mark doesn't discuss much about the vagueness of the language with which the court ordered Alabama to redraw things. Did I put one away on this? I thought that I did. Yeah. Here we are. We've got, we've got another break, coming up. But maybe the talking points memo piece on this, and it's not that long. We can get started with it before we exit. On the situation is the one I had in mind. Alabama Legislative Committee advances map that ignores SCOTUS ruling, again diluting black power, writes Kate Riga for Talking Points memo. But our music is coming up to interrupt that. Republican Alabama legislators advanced new congressional maps on Monday, that was last week, with just one black majority district, seemingly spitting in the eye of the Supreme Court, which had just sent it back to the drawing board. And really, it was this language. Any remedial plan will need to include two districts, in which black voters either comprise a voting age majority or something quite close to it. And now the question is 39% quite close to it? It's not, but they'll argue it is. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. How about just a little bit more from the TPM article to see if we can clarify the point a little further? But yeah, essentially, it was weasel words, if you ask me. Now, well, at least in hindsight, weasel words from the court on this. I'm sure that at the time, the court certainly thought that they were being clear about things, and it may even be that people reading the opinions thought that they were being clear about things, because all of the mainstream traditional media folks have framed this as Alabama defying the orders of the court, which is fine by me. I mean, it's a great way of putting it. Certainly, it's a little bit spinny in that if you look closely at the words, they could have made themselves a lot clearer. Look, why not end it here, right? Any remedial plan will need to include two districts in which black voters either comprise a voting age majority or something. Well, I just end it right there. The or something quite close to it is what's going to create, well, it already has created these problems. So let's see. Alabama lawmakers had been trying to get away with an older iteration of the map that had only one majority black district. Those challenging it, who won in the court's June decision, demanded two, commensurate with the voting population of black Alabamans. And they shouldn't have had such, I'm sure the court was probably thinking Roberts and his conservative bloc were probably saying, we don't want to be ordering the states to do this or that. But basically, we want to draw the parameters so narrowly that they have really very little choice other than to come back either with two majority black districts or one majority black district and one 50-50 district or something like that. That's what they mean by very close to it. It's not 51-49. It's 50-50. Fine. We'll accept that. Okay. But then Alabama was, basically asking, all right, so but what about 49-51? What about 48-52? What about 47-53? What about 39-61? Like, come on here, guys. This is ridiculous. Anyway, so I guess they just decided to keep pushing and say, well, what is quite quite close to it mean? And what if we don't really care to give it a serious interpretation? We just throw something completely different and say, well, that's what we thought you meant. It will take you a year to fix that and to tell us, no, we really mean it. It has to be over 48%, let's say. And they'll be reluctant to nail something down on it. But whatever they do, it'll take them long enough to do that they'll be able to say, well, why don't we say all of your great wisdom, Supreme Court, all you people, we'll put it to work next time because it's really close to the election and just things are so confusing. And why don't you just let us get away with it one more time, essentially? And then maybe we can sue a couple more times and screw up a few more things. And maybe you'll let us do the 26 elections that way too. And then pretty soon we'll be like, well, we're almost about to redistrict anyway. Why don't you just let us do the 28s? And we're going to redistrict next year anyhow. So 2030, we'll get it right. And then maybe they do, maybe they don't. And in the meantime, a decade, 5 Congresses worth of discriminatory maps, not to mention the 100 Congresses prior that have had discriminatory maps. Anyway, so where were we with this TPM piece? We'll get through it here. Alabama lawmakers have been trying to get away with an older iteration of the map. Those challenging it who won demanded 2. And, that's the remedy they asked for. And the court just should have said, you asked for this. It's not our design. It's yours. You asked for this remedy. You proved that you were entitled to it. The state didn't defend against it sufficiently such that we were moved to draw a different remedy. Here, 2. That's the answer. They don't have to make it about them dictating. It's just about them affirming the request for relief. Anyway, Alabama State Representative Chris England, a Democrat, shared the new map and its demographic breakdown on Twitter, which is now X or something like that, which is stupid for various reasons. One district on the map is 53% black and 43% white. The next largest black population share in a district is only 44% as compared to 52% white. All of the Democrats on the committee opposed the new map. It'll go to the full legislature this week. Alabama may be following in the footsteps of Ohio, where Republican legislators flatly refused to follow the state Supreme Court's order to redraw their maps. Remember that? They instead pursued legal appeals, including to the Supreme Court. Some expect that appeal to be rejected in light of another significant redistricting decision out of North Carolina and for remapping to begin in the state this summer. But the Alabama lawmakers are being even bolder in contradicting a direct opinion from the U.S. Supreme Court. Sorta, kinda. Legal challenges are likely to follow if the proposed map stands. But who cares, because it'll take too long. There's already a preset federal district court hearing on August 14th to review the map's compliance with the Voting Rights Act, the law under which Alabama's previous map was challenged. It is critical that Alabama be fairly and accurately represented in Washington. Alabama Governor Kay Ivey said as she called the legislature back for a special session. Our legislature knows our states better than the federal courts do. And I guess they know it so well that they deny that there are any black people in Alabama. In ruling against Alabama officials earlier this summer, the Supreme Court sustained one of the last remaining powers of the VRA. It ensured that vote dilution cases, lawsuits where plaintiffs try to prove that states have gerrymandered districts to weaken minority voters' power, either by cracking them into multiple districts or packing them into all one district, can still be taken to court. The Roberts Court is otherwise known for hobbling the VRA, both by effectively nullifying preclearance, we know what that is, and by subsequently making it harder to bring cases challenging discriminatory voting laws. That second case, Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, was decided against the backdrop of a flood of voter restrictions unleashed by freeing mostly southern states from the preclearance requirements. The Alabama decision, with Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh joining the liberals, stunned nearly all the voting rights world. And so it did. It did. And that doesn't mean that it'll last. And it doesn't mean that it's disingenuous either. It just means that they are perhaps rightly embarrassed by how badly wrong Roberts got it the first time around. Okay. So anyway, that's what's happening. I thought I would bring you up to speed on that. And several other things we need to discuss. Let's take a slightly different turn at this point. There are any number of directions to go in, but something that was written up last week that I didn't get a chance to discuss on the show, but I was moved to discuss on social media, which I thought was of some interest. Oh, by the way, speaking of the Alabama story, I guess this is the TPM piece was valuable and helpful in explaining or, giving us the quote from the justice about why it was not necessarily a direct defiance, just a very, very stupid, but almost plausibly stupid interpretation of what they have handed. I had a similar thing from what I think is an AP story, which ran under the headline of Alabama Republicans reject call for second majority black district despite Supreme Court ruling. Kim Chandler wrote it for the Associated Press. I just thought it was interesting that it came to me via social media, I guess probably from a Canadian user who linked to, I thought this was interesting, this was the first one that I came across in that day's discussion of things that I pocketed, and it was from Moose Jaw Today. Like, thank you, Moose Jaw, Canada. Is it Alberta? Moose Jaw? I don't even know. But at any rate, we had to get my Alabama news from Moose Jaw. That was a little embarrassing, but it was an AP story, so they're interested in it in Moose Jaw too. Anyway, did they have any other? I don't think they had any real additional views or angles on this thing, but I think that's where I first noticed that the language was a little bit vague. Here's a couple of there's a point or two here made by Democratic legislators from Alabama that are important, right? Democrats accused Republicans of rushing the process and thwarting the court's directive. It says here, Senator Vivian Davis Figures, if that's the right pronunciation of her last name, a Democrat from Mobile, said the court was clear that the state should create a second majority black district or something close to it. But then they added 42% is not close to 50. In my opinion, 49 is close to 50, Figures said. She had urged colleagues to adopt a proposal by the plaintiffs in the Supreme Court case that would make the second district 50% black. So here, just, for the record, the Supreme Court basically hands them a dictate, make a second majority black district or something quite close to it. And the local Democratic legislators, seeing what they're up against in Alabama, said, well, all right, look, I'll even give you this. If you make one that's 53% black, we'll let you get away with making the second one 50-50. That's not black majority, but it is something quite close to it, and that would be in compliance with what the Supreme Court said. And if you don't want to give two majority black districts, fine. Give one where there's an even shot, one way or the other, 50-50. And Alabama Republicans still said no, still said we're going to grab a little bit more. I thought that was, something worth adding. Anyway, now back to the other direction that I was going to go with the big story that was reported last week. And I don't know how much discussion it got because it wasn't, horse race politics or former guy indictment or anything like that. But it was more about Harlan Crow and an interesting scheme that he was involved in, which of course had everything to do with his essentially straight ahead bribery of Clarence Thomas. But I was fascinated by it because it outlined yet another strategy by the super rich to get away with stuff that you and I could only, dream about being able to do, even if we wouldn't be willing to do it if we had the opportunity. I thought this was kind of amazing. And just another great story of how the weirdness of our tax codes and our unwillingness to actually enforce the tax codes that we have. I mean, this is a facial violation of the law and should be prosecuted as such, but we don't have the personnel to do it. and to pursue the cases in the IRS. And every time we try to hire those people, Republicans say, jackbooted thugs are going to be having armed agents kicking down everyone's door. We got to stop this. It's fascism. And of course, every Republican accusation is in fact a confession, and the fascism is on their part. But here's the deal. ProPublica, once again, leading the way on this one. How Harlan Crow slashed his tax bill by taking Clarence Thomas on those super yacht cruises. Paul Keel writes back on July 17th. Really quite devious, a little astonishing, a little genius, all wrapped up in one. In lavishing gifts on the Supreme Court justice, our subheader says, the billionaire GOP donor may have violated tax laws, according to tax experts, and he did. But I love the design of some of these things. It's very, I don't know what. It's very illegal. How about that? Or should be. For months, Harlan Crow and members of Congress have been engaged in a fight over whether the billionaire needs to divulge details about his gifts to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, including globe-trotting trips aboard his 162-foot yacht, the Michaela Rose. Crow's lawyer argues that Congress has no authority to probe the GOP donor's generosity, and that doing so violates a constitutional separation of powers between Congress and the Supreme Court. But something unitary executive, there aren't three branches of government. But unitary executive theory specifically addresses the powers of the executive and doesn't have, I guess, technically much to say about the separation of powers and checks and balances as between Congress and the Supreme Court. But anyway, members of Congress say there are federal tax laws underlying their interest and a known propensity by the ultra-rich to use their yachts to skirt those laws. That's got legislative purpose written all over it. Tax data obtained by ProPublica provides a glimpse of what the congressional investigators would find if Crow were open his books to them. Crow's voyages with Thomas, the data shows, contributed to a nice side benefit. They helped reduce Crow's tax bill. So not only do the ultra-rich have got an army of lawyers arranging for new tax breaks for them or novel interpretations of tax law such that they're not paying as much in taxes by percentage as you and I are. They have billions of dollars. They're paying a lower effective rate than we are. But they have tax subsidy regimes in place for their yachts, which is amazing. So, the rich, as we've reported, that being ProPublica, often deduct millions of dollars from their taxes related to buying and operating their jets and yachts. Crow followed that formula through a company that purported to charter his super yacht. And you will recognize the elements of this, by the way, as we go along. If you substitute Donald Trump for Harlan Crow and substitute private jets for private super yachts, we have seen the exact same play already. This is a tactic that's shared among the rich. So Harlan Crow's not the only one that does this. It's just that he's using it to bribe Clarence Thomas, whereas Donald Trump uses it to bribe himself. Anyway, the rich, as they've often reported, benefit or cut their taxes by operating their jets and yachts through companies that purport to charter them back to themselves. In other words, I've bought myself a super yacht. No, I haven't. I created a company, Harlan Crow Super Yachts LLC, and it is in the business of, one, acquiring a super yacht, and two, leasing, quote unquote, the super yacht to me. I don't own the super yacht. Harlan Crow Super Yachts LLC owns it. It's not my problem. I'm not bribing him. If anybody, Harlan Crow Super Yachts LLC is bribing him, but that's not actually even the point of doing this. A closer examination of how Crow used the yacht raises questions about his compliance with the tax code, experts said. Despite Crow's representations to the IRS, ProPublica reporters could find no evidence that his yacht company was actually a profit-seeking business, as the law requires. In other words, the company's not really a company. He could claim it was a nonprofit, but he's not doing that, because if he does that, then it screws up the claim he's trying to make. Based on what information is available, this has the look of a textbook billionaire tax scam, said Senate Finance Committee Chair Ron Wyden, Everyone knows about Ron Wyden and his stances on these things. Joan does. These new details only raise more questions about Mr. Crow's tax practices, which could begin to explain why he's been stonewalling the Finance Committee's investigation for months. Crow, through a spokesperson, declined to respond to ProPublica's questions, as ProPublica reported in April. Crow lavished gifts on Thomas for over 20 years, often in the form of luxury trips on Crow's jet and yacht. One focus of the investigations is whether Crow disclosed his generosity toward Thomas to the IRS, since large gifts are subject to the gift tax. Another is whether Crow treated his trips with Thomas as deductible business expenses. While the data sheds light on how Crow might have accounted for Thomas's trips, there are no clear implications for Thomas's own taxes, experts said. Although I'm not 100% certain about that either. Maybe not for Thomas's taxes, but certainly for his disclosures. Remember, of course, he's saying, I thought I didn't have to disclose these things because this was the hospitality of a good, close personal friend. But if Crow is saying that the trips that he takes with Clarence Thomas are deductible business expenses, first of all, what effing business is that supposed to be? And second of all, if it's a business expense, then it's not a close personal friend hospitality situation. It obviates that whole thing and leaves Thomas hanging out to dry, which is fine by me. But that's not even the point of this. The scheme is still to be laid out here. Crow's entry into the world of super yacht owners came nearly 40 years ago. By 1984, his father, Trammell Crow, had forged his real estate fortune, and Harlan, then in his 30s, was taking an increasing role in the family business. That year, father and son worked together to erect the 50-story Trammell Crow Center in downtown Dallas. They also formed a company, Rochelle Charter Incorporated. It's not quite as straight ahead as Harlan Crow Super Yachts LLC, but Rochelle Charter Incorporated, with the purpose of leasing out their new yacht, the Michaela Rose. Now, is it a yacht leasing company like you two for $250,000 a week can pretend you're super rich and lease the yacht from us? No, it's them leasing the yacht from themselves. ProPublica's trove of IRS data, which contains tax information for thousands of wealthy individuals, includes both Harlan Crow and his parents, who filed jointly. The data shows his parents with a majority share in Rochelle Charter. After they both died, Harlan Crow took full control in 2014. ProPublica's data for the company runs from 2003 to 2015. Rochelle Charter reported losing money in 10 of those 13 years. How does it lose money when it is the owner of a mega yacht that everybody in the world wants to be on, including Supreme Court justices and very rich people? And after all, what is this deal about? I don't really quite understand it. So the company buys the yacht and they lease it to the rich people. So the rich people have to pay to use their own yacht? Yeah, technically, at first, but how much, right? If it's, you wouldn't be surprised to find out it's $250,000 a week to rent a yacht like that. What if they rent it to the owners of Rochelle Charter for $1 a week? Well, that would be terrible business practice. Rochelle Charter would lose money hand over fist. But who cares? Because the ownership of Rochelle Charter is the Crow family. Are they going to push the company to do better? Probably not, because it's costing them $1 to use their rent to rent their yacht. And of course, by the way, Rochelle Charter then says, oh my God, our income taxes have to be not only less than zero, we should be getting money back from the government because we're losing money like crazy. And by the way, the ownership of Rochelle Charter is also therefore losing money like crazy, but they can then say, but those are business losses. It's not a loss of, you can't buy a super yacht for $250 million, say, and say, I lost $250 million this year, government, pay for it. No, they'll say, you bought yourself a boat. But if you form a company and it's wholly owned by you and you buy a boat and then you do business so poorly that you lose let's say $2 million a year in poor leasing plans, that you can say is a business loss that you can deduct. And because the company that did the leasing is wholly owned by the Crow family, they can say, well, sure, we made millions and millions of dollars in construction and development, but we should have our tax bill offset by our millions of dollars in losses from Rochelle leasing. It's just that we lost all that money to ourselves by leasing a boat to ourselves for $1. You see how crooked this really is, right? So overall, it says the net losses totaled nearly $8 million, with about half flowing to Harlan Crow. By using those deductions to offset income from other sources, the Crows saved on taxes. The wealthy often find ways to deduct the expense of a private jet. The records don't make it clear whether Crow is doing so. But you can do it with jets, you can do it with boats, you can do it with both if you have both. It's the way Trump operated his planes, but he was more obvious and I think called it like Trump plane leasing services or something like that. And because he can't help himself to putting his name on things. Anyway, for Crow, the tax breaks from his yacht were just one way he was able to achieve a lighter tax burden. The tax code is particularly friendly to commercial real estate titans, as it turns out, and Trump definitely knows that. And Crow enjoyed low taxes during that same period. He was already getting low taxes because of all the deductions he was able to take because he's in the business of commercial real estate development. He paid an average income tax rate of 15%, according to IRS data. You were paying 30 or so. It's a rate typical of the very wealthiest Americans, but lower than the personal federal tax rates of even many middle-income workers. Crow's biggest deduction from Michaela Rose came in 2014, when, after the death of his mother, Crow decided to renovate the yacht. The interior needed updating to fit more contemporary notions of glamour, they note here parenthetically. For one, less gold plating. The work was expensive. Crow's tax information shows a $1.8 million loss from Rochelle Charter that year. You want your mom dies and you want to redecorate the yacht, make Rochelle Charter do the redecoration. It costs $1.8 million. You got to come up with the cash somewhere to pay for the renovation. But then in the end, you say, that's a $1.8 million loss for this other company I own. And that should offset my taxes, even though the company you own is all about giving yourself a yacht. In order to claim these sorts of deductions, taxpayers must be engaged in a real business, though. Right? When it's actually trying to make a profit. Like if you're leasing the yacht when you're not on it to other people and you're making a genuine effort to do so, then you're just unlucky in business. But if you're the only client of this leasing company, or you try to fake up the idea that I really am trying to lease. Look, I have a web page that's not findable at all and doesn't say what the price is, and I never respond to inquiries. That won't cut it, but you have to be able to find that information and agree to prosecute it, and an understaffed IRS can't do that, and they know it. So, in order to claim these sorts of deductions, taxpayers must be engaged in a real business, one that's actually trying to make a profit. If expenses dwarf revenues year after year, like say 10 out of the last 13 years, as is the case here, the IRS might conclude the activity is more of a hobby. That could lead to the deductions being disallowed, plus penalties. Nevertheless, the ultra-wealthy often pass off their costly pastimes, like horse racing, for instance, as profit-seeking businesses. In doing so, they essentially dare the IRS to prove otherwise in an audit. But we know that those don't happen. For a yacht owner to meet the legal standard of operating a for-profit business, said Michael Kosnitsky, a co-chair of the private client and family office group at the law firm Pillsbury Winthrop, he said, you have to be regularly chartering the yacht to third parties at fair market value, typically through an independent charter broker. ProPublica interviewed around a dozen former crew members of the Michaela Rose, some of whom spent years aboard the ship, and none said that they were aware of the boat ever being chartered. ProPublica also reviewed cruising schedules for 3 different years. According to the former staff and the schedules, use of the vessel appears to have been limited to Crow's family, friends, and executives of Crow's company, along with their guests. Moreover, in an attempt to trademark the name of his yacht, did you know he even tried to do that? Crow struggled to provide evidence that he chartered his ship. Why would you need to trademark the name? You're not in trade. In 2019, an attorney representing Rochelle Charter filed an application with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office for this request. This required demonstrating commercial use of the name Michaela Rose. The attorney of the law firm Locke Lord, that's the name of the attorney, or rather the firm, wrote that the name was used for, quote, yacht charter services for entertainment purposes, and as evidence attached a brochure. And it has all sorts of things like pictures and says the magnificent yacht has cruised all over the world, yada, yada, yada. But it said nothing about chartering because it wasn't really supposed to be chartered. Registration is refused, says the patent office, because the specimen does not show that the applied for mark is in use in commerce. This wasn't a business. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. Okay, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We'll jump off of the Michaela Rose, the super yacht of Harlan Crow, for just a moment, and welcome Joan McCarter to the show. And yeah, I guess we have to start planning for the August. The August recess applies to Joan as well, right? Congress is going to skip town. It makes a good time for her to take her vacation break. But we have today and next week to remind you all that the government is going to shut down and it's going to be a huge disaster. And Harlan Crow will be sailing around at your expense the whole time. And at any rate, I can conclude the ProPublica report by, I'll shoehorn in that he eventually did get his trademark of the Michaela Rose super yacht name by asking the Patent and Trademark Office to reconsider by sending them screenshots from some websites, superyachts.com, one of my favorite websites. I'm on there all the time. And either, I don't know whether it's live yachting or live yachting. It could be either one. And apparently they had pages there where they said, we offer yacht chartering services all the time. Now, they charter them to themselves. And somebody else was pointing out, just because you're on superyachts.com or liveliveyachting.com doesn't mean you're actually available for charter. Lots of the boats on there are not available for charter. But basically, the Patent and Trademark Office guys were like,
fine, whatever.
Yeah, you know what? Another billionaire with another yacht. All right, the guy says he charters it. He charters it. Go ahead. Go ahead and do it. And so they got, I don't know if that was worth anything to them, but that I guess helps them in court say, no, we're a real business. So we just lose money every year because we only have one client. It's weird.
That was such an informative article.
I
felt really naive and dumb coming out of it that I didn't know that owning yachts and private planes was basically a tax write-off.
It is amazing. And you know what?
It hadn't occurred to me. I thought, they have these things because they like these toys.
Right. They got lots of money.
They like these toys, but they also like that they can write off the taxes.
Yes.
Have them as businesses that lose money.
Right.
It astounded me to find that out, which again made me feel pretty naive and not
Yeah.
very bright.
I understand the feeling, and I guess doubly so for me because I realized first I was like, I can't believe it, and then I was like, wait a minute, I know this. This happened. This is how Trump runs his private jets.
Right.
And I said, now I'm twice as dumb. They've already told me this, and I still don't. Yeah, all right. Well, anyway, but between that and that's how you get into horse racing, right? I'm paying $18 million for a horse, and we're going to race him, I don't know, 3 times a year in the Triple Crown or whatever. And then what? I don't know. Well, actually, I do know, but, it's a family show. Anyway. But at any rate, you have your super expensive hobbies, and it's not because you have billions of dollars that you can burn on it. It's because the federal government is subsidizing the whole thing. You can't have free lunch in school, though, kids, because that's socialism. But free yachts, well, not free, but subsidized yachting, in case you want to bribe any Supreme Court justices, that's available to you. But yeah, that's how Trump runs his planes. His companies buy the planes and lease them to him for nothing. And then they cry to the government that my leasing company is losing money hand over fist, so you can't tax me on my golden apartments or anything like that. Oh, okay. So that works out just fine. So that's what Harlan Crow was doing. Subsidized bribery of Justice Thomas. And that had the bonus, of course, of saying, if anybody ever said, this is crazy, we should absolutely take him to, I don't know, court about this. Oh, you're going to take me to court, are you? Well, it just so happens that a little more than 10% of the Supreme Court rides on this boat all the time, and they think the arrangement is awesome. And maybe I should take some more people like that. Or some other billionaire can do it with the rest of the court, and you know what? They'll uphold the law. So that kind of sucks. And that was on full display for me last week on my vacation, my non-super yacht vacation, to a place where a lot of people take their super yachts to their private islands in the Bahamas.
Oh,
and,
nice.
It was a nice vacation, like a moderate, normal person vacation. But I'm surrounded by people who do it in a different style. And there were some very large boats out there and some very sizable private islands out there, including one that was owned, apparently, had just recently been sold to a pharmaceuticals billionaire, which I thought was really remarkable, considering that it was probably paid for with money that people had to give him when they sold their houses so they could pay for chemotherapy. And he used that money to buy himself a 19th mansion on a private island. And that made me sad during my vacations. So that sucked. So that's even worse.
That is worse.
Yeah. Not only were they robbing people, but I felt bad, and that was not good. Anyway.
On your vacation.
Yeah,
I think
right.
You should sue.
I should. If I had money to burn on, maybe I can lease myself some lawyers. I'll see if I can make that work. Anyway, so while I was away, as it turns out, I'm going to ask you, do you know, are the Freedom Caucus nuts just pretending they never made the demand that all 12 appropriations bills had to be reported out of committee before anything came to the floor? Because I read your piece that says they're bringing the first 2 already, but they've only cleared 10. Is that right?
Out of committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, okay. So I guess my question is, did they just forget it?
I mean, they just, whatever.
Well, we asked for it. We didn't get it.
They're not really paying attention, and the goalposts change on a daily basis with them.
Okay.
Yesterday it was, let's see, we have to close the border. This was Chip Roy. No more money for Ukraine, and we have to make the government like it was pre-COVID, which, what does that even mean?
I guess that means like some of the...
We pretend like COVID never happened.
Yeah,
COVID didn't happen, so we say, okay, the government is pre-COVID.
I guess so.
Like expunging President Trump's impeachments.
Yeah, right. With those
it
happened.
Didn't happen.
Yeah, one of them was pre-COVID, right? So he can go. Maybe he should only be impeached once, because the other one was during COVID. I don't know. Yeah, who knows what that really means.
At any rate, no, they do not have any consistent line other than keep cutting, keep cutting, keep cutting. The goal is, of course, to shut down government, because it always is, because I don't know why.
Yeah.
They like to.
They do, and they do occasionally.
They don't win.
Yeah, I don't know why
I really don't understand where the impulse continues to come from, but it's very real, and here we go again.
Yeah. Well, they don't seem to learn I don't know. They seem to understand that it's bad for them. They just don't do anything to avoid it. And then some of them get enthusiastic about it. Well, I guess just like everything else, default isn't going to be bad. Well, shutdowns aren't going to be bad, but everybody else knows. No, I've been here for that.
One of the big problems is when you are a Freedom Caucus member, you are coming from a district of people as crazy as you are, yes, and you don't have to worry about being reelected.
Yeah, I guess that's
so
part of the reason.
They don't think of it as this is a political disaster because they're fine. They go home and people love them.
Yeah.
And they don't also seem to care whether or not the Republicans are in the majority.
Oh, well then, I mean, if they don't have any preference, I do.
Doesn't it seem like that?
Yeah, I guess you would think, but they would get cranky if they lost. I don't know if they could articulate why that would be bad for them, but
I don't know that they would correlate shutting down the government with losing 18 seats to Democrats.
Yeah, they would.
Which is the very real possibility, because there are 18 members of Congress, freshmen mostly, sitting in seats that would have gone to Joe Biden. That went to Joe Biden in 2020.
Yeah.
That they won in 2022. And so, yes, they are vulnerable. And when the government shuts down, they're going to be blamed.
Yeah, although they'll, I guess, just blame it on vote rigging and illegal aliens voting.
Yeah, when the government shuts down over abortion?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what they're capable of believing, I guess, but yeah,
because this is the thing that could happen, because they are putting in these horrible anti-abortion, forced birther, anti-trans care, all of these kinds of riders into every possible bill, every possible appropriations bill.
Yes, where they don't belong. Of course,
they're not germane. I mean, McCarthy said last week, "No, we're not going to let these be Christmas trees." That's what he said about the defense authorization.
Oh,
it's a Christmas tree.
Well, yeah.
He just capitulates to everything. And here we are. So, yeah, the Senate is not going to be able to accept all of these. Yeah, I'm afraid some are going to sneak in just because, Senate Democrats don't like the idea of shutting down government, so they hold their breath or hold their noses, I should say, and swallow some of this crap.
Yeah, maybe. I guess it could happen.
But most of it is going too far, and it's not going to fly. So they are putting themselves in the position of doing a really, really electorally unpleasant, unpopular thing, and shutting down government over abortion. So, more power to them. It's plenty of fodder for...
Well, less power, let's say. But yes, go ahead, or we'll use the please proceed line, I suppose, with the idea that eventually there would be less power to them. But okay, more power to you getting less power, let's say. Well, this is going to be fascinating. Of course, for them to choose. I guess they're just stuck in the past, or that's what's been in their box, that comes in the mail every time they file their candidacy, what to say, and it's be anti-abortion, even as evidence racks up everywhere that really even Republicans aren't reliably anti-abortion in greater numbers. Saw some very surprising polling on that Greg went over with us yesterday, that I forget what we were looking at, but Republican primary voters not willing to say in majority numbers that they were for any of these abortion restrictions, and in fact coming to what were previously known as pro-choice positions, 55% of respondents to a survey of likely Republican primary voters saying they didn't want any more restrictions on abortion. Okay. But, the rule book for being a Republican says maximalist opposition to abortion at all times. They just never rewrote the rule book for what happens when some of these things start to get passed and people find it to be offensive and are angry about it. Oh, I don't know. We didn't write that.
Well, one of the things is that you don't actually pursue the national abortion ban you promised, which they are not doing in the House. But essentially what they are doing is a national abortion ban. If they're getting the federal government out of it in every way possible, if they are saying that even states that where abortion is legal can't use their own state funding in Medicaid to allow for abortions, then we're talking about a national abortion ban. Because that's one of the things that they're doing in the Health and Human Services appropriations. They're saying no Medicaid funding at all can go to abortions. And, that's going to be a legal fight, whether you can say the Medicaid law says no abortions.
Yes.
Even when it's the state's contribution to Medicaid. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but that's what they're trying. So, Oregon can't put any of its funding that it pays into the Medicaid program. None of that can go to abortion services.
Possibly.
I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah.
I don't think the blue states are going to stand for that. So, if it survives in the bill, and I don't think it will. I think that's one that the Democrats in the Senate will probably say no to. But,
that seems to be one of their lines, yes. And, I guess it's also an open question. Even if it does survive, this could be one of those things. Sometimes you have, sometimes Democrats say, well, we're afraid of being hauled into court. And so, in an abundance of caution, and it's happened on the abortion front, right? As well, especially among private actors, the doctors, and providers saying, we just can't risk prosecution under these draconian new laws. But states, of course, are different entities. And we are seeing that there are a lot of places on a lot of other fronts where they're saying, the worst that happens is we lose in court. It's a different thing when the worst that happens is I go to prison. That's right. That's different, but you can't imprison the whole state yet. I don't think they're working on it, I guess. But yes, so states are and local entities are in a position. We were just reading about earlier in the show about Glenn Youngkin's model rules for school boards, anti-trans rules. Barring them, a renewed attempt at barring people from bathrooms and sports and everything else. But one by one, local school boards saying, what if we just don't adopt these rules, or say we're going to have the opposite of these rules? They can't arrest the county, so it'll be a court case. We may lose, we may not lose. I don't think we'll lose, but we may see that on a state by state basis and say, yes, there's a lot of Medicaid money that would be at stake that I suppose we could lose some or be penalized in some way, but we're going to have a court rule on this first and tell us with a straight face that state money is really federal money because states' rights, et cetera, et cetera. It's, okay, sure. Do you have enough nutball federal judges to make it work? In the end,
yes, you do.
Yes, maybe. You certainly have lots at the district court level who will say, yeah, that makes sense to me. State money is really federal money. And, in the middle.
You can get the fifth to agree, and you probably can.
Yeah, in limited circumstances. They will. Remember, they're now no longer bound by logical consistency. Well, in this case, state money is federal money. In other cases where it comes out better for us to say it isn't, it won't be. That's all right with us. I mean, will we write that down and look foolish? Yeah.
Yes.
So,
That's okay.
yeah.
We're getting what we wanted.
Yeah. I've been appointed for life. Do I look foolish? Sure. Can I get on a super yacht? Probably. So what's the difference? So,
Yay.
bad news all around.
So anyway, yes, what they're trying to do is de facto national abortion bans.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
They're putting it on the ballot, so that's the good thing out of this.
Okay. And yeah, people have the opportunity to surprise the rest of their fellow Americans by rejecting some of these things on a state-by-state basis. But now it'll be on the 2024 congressional election ballots as well.
Yay.
Okay. 18 seats.
Meanwhile, government's going to shut down.
Yeah, right. We'll inherit that problem.
And Kevin McCarthy told Sean Hannity last night they've got all they need, or they're working on all they need to impeach Joe Biden.
Oh, right, well.
Because sure.
Yeah, is it going to happen in August or? I'm not certain. While government, that would be something. Wouldn't it? Shut down government and then impeach.
Next month, in September, rather, to start that they're impeaching Joe Biden when the government's going to be shutting down.
Yeah, or even after, right? The government's closed, but we're also impeaching. Yeah.
Over Hunter Biden dick pics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Marjorie really liked those pics, so.
Yes, she did.
I understand she blew them up into posters and displayed them in the committee hearing.
Yes.
That's
yes,
really
she did.
something. Well, at least it's not porn. When Republicans do it, it's educational, I guess. If it's on a statue, it's porn. So, I don't know. That was an odd thing to do. By the way.
You know the crazy thing?
Yeah? Oh, there's a crazy thing. What is it?
She got kicked out of the Freedom Caucus.
Right. You would think this would make her get back in.
Yeah. I mean, I just don't get it. McCarthy hasn't said boo to her about it, apparently, even though he's been, asked to. I don't think he's confronted her about it at all.
Right. Well.
And yet she's been booted from the Freedom Caucus.
Maybe Lauren Boebert thought she stole the idea to blow up the dick pic pictures.
That is quite possible.
And that's why you're kicked out. I don't know. Here's a question. If there's a government shut, I guess it depends on who's funded and who's not. But if the applicable funds are not approved and there's a partial government shutdown and they impeach Biden, but there's no funding for the courts, is he allowed to show up to preside over the trial?
And that's a good question.
Or do they have, or how do they fund the courts? That's not independently. I mean, it has to be appropriated somewhere.
It's appropriated, yeah.
Is it in justice?
It's in justice, and I can't remember which barrel it's in. But yeah.
That would be something.
Congress controls the purse strings for the court. That's one of the things, in fact, Van Hollen made noises about. He's the subcommittee chair for justice on the appropriations committee.
Okay.
He made noise about saying, okay, you're not going to get some of your funding if you don't adopt an ethics rule. He offered the amendment. It was rejected because
reasons. All right.
So yeah, they're in control of that money, which they should be using.
So
as Van Hollen wanted. Anyway, the Senate's not going to take up the impeachment? I think we can be pretty darn certain.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to, do they?
I mean, I guess not. Normally, you would say, yeah, they do. But I mean, I think we went through this with Trump. Was would they absolutely have to take up such a trial? They could handle it in various ways. I imagine if they decided to take it up, they wouldn't want to. But if they decided they had to, and the Department of Justice wasn't operating, the courts were not supposed to be operating, I think that at some point they'd say, all right, well, the Chief Justice is essential personnel and not subject to the shutdown. But, well, it would be pretty weird, of course. It would be very interesting if he also could, if he's an essential personnel, but his staff isn't. And he's like, I have to preside with like no help whatsoever. I wonder, that'd be interesting. Let's delay this trial until.
I don't think this is something John Roberts wants anything to do
No,
with.
I would imagine not. But I'm sure he can depend, I think, on the Senate to say, well, even if we decide we're forced to do something with this impeachment, it won't involve you because we're not going to trial.
Can it just be referred to committee?
It could be. I mean, lots of impeachments are. It's never happened, of course, with the presidential impeachment, but there's only, a couple of those around to go by. But, of course, the Constitution requires that he preside over any trial, but they could just invent some sort of pre-trial procedure that happens in committee, and there's just a recommendation made not to proceed any further. They'll hear some evidence and all that stuff that seems trial-like.
Look at Marjorie Taylor Greene's posters.
Right, sure. It will make any senators that have, say, Valentine's Day plans.
Right.
Will have to take the posters with them and say, you consider the evidence while you're on your break. But, it may ruin your dinner, but.
This is to say if, the House really truly does this and it passes, which.
Yes. And that's a questionable thing.
I don't know. Does it pass?
You're right.
So far, the moderates in the House, the others, is I've heard them called the ones who weren't Freedom Caucus, the others.
Oh, yeah.
So far, they really haven't shown much in the way of spine when it comes to not doing the crazy things the Freedom Caucus is making everybody do. So we'll see.
Yes. And, I imagine if you vote no on an impeachment, you find yourself targeted and primaried, et cetera. But, by now they're used to that threat. How they'll react to it, I don't know.
Speaking of which, this was kind of fun. I found out yesterday the Club for Growth is putting in millions of dollars to the 20 members who opposed one or all of Kevin McCarthy's votes for Speaker.
Oh. Well, I guess they feel like they've been pushed out of the crazy extremist role by the Freedom Caucus. And I don't know, does that buy them back in, deal them back in?
This is hedging against McCarthy using his power, all his great power to primary them.
I guess so. All right.
So that was kind of fun.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's an interesting development. So, yeah, I mean, further weakens McCarthy's ability to do anything. He can't. It's not just, if he finds some way of isolating the Freedom Caucus, he still has the Club for Growth to deal with. That's a name from the past. Like I saw, Freedom Works came up again today in my reading. Like, oh, you're still there.
They're still there.
Okay. That's very Tea Party-ish. And, I thought they had been surpassed. But I guess Club for Growth is still around.
The Koch organization still exists. It's not the Koch brothers anymore. One of them being dead. It's the Koch network.
I see.
And it's still there, and there's still money, and I think they're floundering a little to an extent. I think they've been eclipsed in The Source of All Evil by Leonard Leo.
Yeah. Well, he's got his own independent pool of money now, so he doesn't need them as much. So I guess they're desperate to get back in the news, but...
what was Freedom Works doing?
I've forgotten already. Let's see. They must have been involved in what were we talking about up at the beginning? Oh, I guess the upcoming appropriations fights. They were taking some role in encouraging people to, take these rather maximalist positions and fight about cutting beyond the caps, etc.
They've already done that.
Yes.
It's cutting beyond the cuts that McCarthy said he would give them.
Yes, right.
There is no bottom to the cuts. I mean, they've completely eliminated already, and this is without Freedom Caucus amendments. They've eliminated Title X funding.
Well, all right. It's an X, right? It all goes to Twitter.
Right. The Teen Pregnancy Prevention Fund. Gone. I mean, they've just zeroed out this stuff. So, yeah, they're coming for contraception, too, by the way.
Yes.
stuff that just absolutely isn't going to fly. So, yeah, we're going to have a government shutdown.
Yeah, just because they can't decide what to destroy more than they already have to. So, yeah, and you give them an agreement and say, all right, we'll come in lower than the caps. All right, but we want to come in lower than the lower.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're really drowning in the bathtub. Yeah, they think that they can do it this time. So.
Well, all right. I guess that's sort of nothing new. But again, this is who you have to negotiate with, is the people who
It is
take
nothing
no.
new. What's new is that there is a completely spineless Speaker of the House who just keeps saying
That's
yes.
the difference. Yeah. I mean, even the wino we used to have, Painter, would, put the glass down occasionally and take the cigarette out of his mouth and say, no, get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
And it worked.
This guy, no, he won't.
No, he can't.
He can't.
Lose one vote and it's all over. So, all right. Wow. Well, this gives us one more week to reiterate the fact that the government is going to shut down.
There are now 16 days, 16 legislative days left for them to figure this out.
All right.
Since nobody seems inclined to cancel any of August recess.
No.
Which starts Friday.
They have to go on super yachts. So, 16 days, 12 appropriation bills to deal with. And impeaching the president. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
All of that happening, and all of the amendments, and I guess probably each one of these appropriations bills is going to be, I would have to imagine most of the big ones are going to be 2-day affairs at minimum, with everybody wanting to.
Yeah.
Well, I want to have the government pay anti-abortion activists to blockade the clinics. So let's have an amendment about that. Whatever they can come up with. And then Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert will fight about who gets to do it. That will be interesting. All right. We got one more follow-up then next week. Thanks, Joan, for coming by. And then you can start thinking vacation thoughts after that.
Yay!
All right. Good to hear from you again today.
From
NetflixRadio.com.
See ya.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
That's right, and now you will be listening to the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam, who brings you his collection of stories from around the country and around the world. Quick, let's see if we can get some of those in here. Alabama Republicans, they're definitely going to be back in the news. We'll take his take on what's going on down there coming up next, and then a tour of the rest of the lands. Stay tuned.